Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I was asked to present the lesson plans I submitted and adopted by the California Department of Education on Korean American history, in particular, Korean American experiences and interethnic relations. So basically, what I'm going to do is go over the lesson plan I developed and share it with all of you. Okay, let me see. I'm trying to, okay. Uh, I believe history is foundation of one's identity. And I believe unless people know their history, their identity is anchorless. This is what I believe. And the simple lesson one, Korean American experiences and interethnic relations, targeted for grade level 11 and 12. And the theme, history and movement, and is Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. And basically, I had to submit based on the form that developed by California Department of Education. So it goes along with basic format of the format that developed by California Department of Education. And purpose and overview is basically uh, examining Koreatown in Los Angeles as a transnational enclave whose formation and development an integral part of America's multicultural history. And the heart of Koreatown is Korean America is in Koreatown, Los Angeles. And Koreatown was a central hotspot of violence during 1992 LA civil unrest or uprising. And Korean Americans were thrust into national and international scenes where they were scapegoated, marginalized, and discriminated against. And the media in particular inflamed so-called Black Korean conflict at the time and exposed the deep-seated interethnic issues plaguing inner city communities. Particularly shooting of Latasha Hollins on March 16, 1991 happened about 2 weeks and 13 days exactly after the beating of African-American Rodney King by highway patrol officers. And the murder of Harlins by liquor store owner Sun Jadu stirred interethnic conflict between Korean Americans and African Americans. And the case went to court and Du received a light sentence with no jail time. And the African American community was outraged and tensions mounted and between two communities. And interethnic relations and the conflicts, racism and police brutality against African Americans fanned the flames of unrest in 1992. When the not guilty verdicts of the police officers involved in the case of the beating of African American Rodney King came back, inner city community residents rose up. And, and today, 1992 LA civil unrest uprising resonates strongly with the communities of color whose voices are being channeled through Black Lives Matter movement. And studying 1992 civil unrest uprising provides framework for students to understand and apply to current events. The manufactured interethnic conflict between Korean Americans, African Americans created by the racially systematic lack of resources, coupled with socioeconomic issues and police brutality issues, are relevant to this day. The multi-ethnic socioeconomic and police brutality issues that African Americans protested about in 1992 are the same issues the Black Lives Matter movement is fighting against now. Thus, it is important to include such a major event in ethnic studies curriculum because 1992 LA civil unrest uprising is a perfect case study in the field of applicable current events. And Korean American identity in the aftermath of the uprising the Korean American community transformed and became visible by exercising their political, social, and community voices. And it has had a profound impact on Korean American community. And number one, a birth of Korean American identity. Although 1.5 and second generation Korean Americans began to use the term Korean Americans in the early 1980s, majority of immigrants, the parents' generation, were unaware of the term Korean American. Instead, they identify strongly themselves as Korean nationals prior to LA riots of 1992. And afterward, it gave a birth or rebirth of Korean American identity, which was a wake-up call, turning point, watershed event for Korean American community. And also it gave them importance of political empowerment, getting involved politically, getting a voice, access, incorporation into mainstream political processes. And since 1992, Korean Americans have been working so hard to get representation. And finally, we had a Korean American elected city councilman a few years ago, and now we have a Korean American city councilman in representing Los Angeles. And we have four congressmen and women representing different districts today. So we have made some progress. And the generational cooperation between 1.5 second generation and immigrant generation will become very important as during and in the aftermath of LA civil unrest and riots, majority of Korean immigrants were voiceless as they were unable to articulate and express their outrage, anguish, and step forward 1.5 and second generation who gave them a voice, represented by such a person as Angela O and others. And role of Korean American churches became also exposed. The majority of Korean immigrant churches were unable to get involved in the community issues, in particularly interethnic relations. So there were calls for Korean American churches to get involved for betterment or to serve the community. Perhaps the most important lessons that Korean American community learned is to become part of the multi-ethnic, multiracial community, proactively get involved, build coalitions, do things together in multi-ethnic, multiracial environment. And as you know, majority of Korean immigrants came from one of the most homogeneous societies in the entire world during the 70s and 80s. They were not prepared. They were ill prepared to cope in a multi-ethnic, multiracial environment. And in the aftermath of 1992 riots, they learned that we have to get involved in the multi-ethnic, multiracial community. And the goal of this lesson plan is to provide overview of the historic, ethnic, political, and social cultural background of Koreatown to understand the formation of the Korean American community as we know it today. The goal is also to introduce concepts in interethnic relations studies through the lens of Korean Americans during 1992 LA civil unrest uprising and contextualize this with current events. The lesson uses the voices of Korean Americans, articles, textbooks, documentaries, and interviews. And the key terms and the concepts, Korean Americans, oral history, Koreatown, 1992 LA civil unrest and uprising, 1965 Immigration Act, Los Angeles, interethnic relations. So these are some of the key terms and the concepts. Objectives, students should be able to better understand the diverse experiences of Korean Americans by engaging a range of primary and secondary sources, including oral histories, textbooks, documentaries, and scholarly articles. Introduce concepts in interethnic relations studies through the lens of the so-called Black Korean conflict and contextualize this with current events. And conduct an interview of someone who was there during the LA civil unrest uprising, or who is Korean American, and students will develop and ask questions. They explore the lived experiences of the subject being interviewed. Students will transcribe the interview and write a short essay on what they learned about Korean American community through the interview. In doing so, students will gain key skills in how to develop and structure interviews, transcriptions, and essays. What are some of the essential questions? What is the history of Koreatown and its formation? How did 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest uprising affect and transform the Korean American community? Why is the Korean American experience important to understand within the context of Asian American studies and US history? And teacher make a note of telling the class, if anyone here has experiences or knows someone with experiences that they feel could help others better understand this content, feel free to add to our discussions. And teacher tells students that they are going to learn about Korean Americans and focus on 3 essential questions and read essential questions 1 and 3 aloud. And steps and activities, and teacher presents some basic information about Korean American history and identity via PowerPoint or other presentation method. And teacher asks students if they have any questions about Korean Americans and write them on the whiteboard. And Arirang documentary on Korean American history by Tom Kaufman would be great resources. And you can show that or ask students to view themselves. And the teacher leads read aloud of the quick fact sheets about the Korean American community in US. Alternate choral reading, teacher reads 1 fact, the whole class read the next fact, and teacher walks around the room, and as students and teacher read the facts, fact sheet attached. And another activities could be teacher and students discuss the quick facts and determine which of the essential questions were answered by the information presented, and go through the questions and answer together. And also another good resources would be the documentary produced by the Young Kim Center is called Footsteps of Korean Americans. Is available for free on YouTube. So anyone can watch this video on IOK Center on Korean American history. And Young Kim Center also has oral history project. And if you go to website of Young Kim Center, you will be able to see approximately more than 50 oral histories that we've conducted so far, and we are going to continue to build up. So any stories or case, one person's story may not be suitable for particular classroom setting, but you can choose and pick. Some important things to point out in the discussion. Korean Americans were caught between 2 worlds. Immigrant and feel the pressure and divide into the United States along racial lines. especially the inner small businesses and inner city communities. So this is very important because, like I said before, majority of Korean immigrants came without really understanding complexity of racial dynamics here in the United States. They simply came to realize their American dreams, and yet it was much more complicated than they expected. And Koreatown's development over the century is evolution from small, unknown community to a recognized ethnic enclave, transnational enclave. Now, today, Koreatown is one of the most visible and celebrated place in Los Angeles. Many young people come to Koreatown to enjoy food, K-pop, and other entertainment. And racial inequalities and mistreatment of Korean Americans during during the 1992 LA civil unrest and uprising, and the historic nature of the scenario and how it applies to other Asian American communities. The racial and socioeconomic disparities that exist in the United States for minority communities, including Asian Americans, African Americans, etc. And learning how Korean Americans embraced their new host society and became visible after the 1992 LA civil unrest uprising, and how Koreatown emerged from ashes of violence and became hotspot for culture, food, and all things that Koreans in America. I think this is very important, how the Koreatown have transformed over the last 30 years. And prior to 1992, Angelenos and majority of Americans were unaware of Korean American, the term Korean Americans or Korea. Majority were unaware, and Korea or Korean America was invisible. No one really knew or cared about Korea or Korean American community. It's only after 1992, all of a sudden, the Angelenos and the Americans were exposed to presence of Korean Americans in Korea. And the Korean American community have come a long way over the last 30 years. Not only we gained visibility, now we are gaining voice in political arena, economically, culturally. So I think this is a very important transformation. And developing an identity of their own as proud Korean Americans. This particularly applies to students of a Korean heritage, Korean American students. And many of them grow up not knowing their own history and cultural identity. And so I think this kind of a lesson plans, not only this particular one, other lesson plans could expose them and give them some strength and proud heritage. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's important. And Memoir of a Cashier, Korean Americans, Racism and Riot. This is a kind of an eyewitness account of second generation Korean American, Carol Park, who worked at her mom's gas station in Watts when LA civil unrest riot erupted. She was only 14 years old. And she's been working there since when she was 12 years old. And she witnessed the conflict, violence, all kinds of crimes during and while she was working as a little kid. And she wrote about her experiences and what it's like to be young Korean American during the turbulence 1990s and during 1992 civil unrest and uprising. According to the author Carol Park, what was the Black Korean conflict? And similar to other minorities, Korean Americans were marginalized and discriminated against throughout United States history. Invisibility of and categorization of Asian American and Pacific Islander groups as model minorities needs to be recognized and discussed. I think this is an important issue, as Asian Americans and Korean Americans often been celebrated as a model minority. To what extent is real and to what extent is a myth? And Asian Americans, as we have experienced over the last year and a half with the rise of anti-Asian hate, and the Asian American, Korean American community have been caught in the middle. And so we need to unbox the myth of model minorities. And Korean American history is important and should be taught about because pivotal moments like the 1992 LA civil unrest and uprising. And social science framework and making connections to the history. Chapter 14 of the framework includes a section, pages 297 and 299, on California's involvement in the civil rights movement during 1960s and discrimination, as well as modern immigration and states post-1965 Immigration Act demographics. The chapter asks two essential questions: where the Korean American experience, LA civil unrest uprising, could fit in under Asian American studies curriculum. What did protests and frustrations expressed by the Californians in the late Cold War era reveal about the state? In what directions is California growing in the 21st century? An assessment to show evidence of what you have learned, the teacher can choose one or two assignments. Write 1 to 3 paragraphs of 5 to 10 sentences, answering each essential question during the evidence from the sources we used, or this discussion group exercise where students collectively write a paper about Korean American experience and answering the 2 essential questions. Each student can be paired with one other student, or there can be a group of 3. Each student in the group writes 1 paragraph. And there are lots of materials and the resources recently developed, written by many different scholars, researchers on Korean American community. So we have gotten a lot of new materials. And like I said before, the Footsteps of Korean Americans, a short documentary of Korean American history, identity, and LA civil unrest, as well as the current issues. And it's available in YouTube. Carol Park's Memoir of a Cashier, and Korean American Oral History Project at the Young Kim Center, and Legacy Project, Preserving the Collective History of Korean Americans, and which is KoreanAmericanHistory.org. Interview with Angela Oh, who became prominent spokesperson during and after LA riot of 1992. You can watch her interview on YouTube, and her view on LA riots after 5 years is also available. And quick facts just about Korean Americans in the United States. Today, Korean American population is roughly about 1.8 million, maybe closer to now 2 million in 2020. And about 1/3 of Korean Americans reside in California. And of course, The Koreatown, LA is one of the largest concentration of Koreans abroad, outside of Korea. And official Korean immigration to the United States began January 13, 1903, with arrival of 102 Korean immigrants in Hawaii as a sugar plantation laborers. March 1920, Korean Americans established the Willows Korean Aviation School Corp in Willows, California. And the school is recognized as the origins of Korean Air Force today. And many Korean Americans donated to start the school, including Jung-Nim Kim, who is known as a Rice King, and he donated more than $50,000 at the time to purchase airplane, hire instructors, and provide all the necessary room and board for the students in 1920. April 12, 1960, Alfred Song became one of the first Asian American to be elected in the city council on Monterey Park. And he later became the first Korean American admitted to the California bar, and first Asian Americans to be elected to the California state legislature as well as the Senate later on. October 3rd, 1965, Hart-Celler Act of 1965 opens the door for immigration in the United States, and the Korean Americans took advantage of all this. And 1970, Korean American population was a little bit less than 70,000. And it increased to 354,000 10 years later in 1980, almost 800,000 by 1990, and 1.2 million by year 2000, and 2020 about 1.7, 1.8 million as more 2020. As we all know, April 29, 1992, one of the most important historical date, Korean Americans call it 4.29, April 29. Los Angeles civil unrest uprising erupt. Koreatown is burned, looted, and businesses are destroyed. Korean Americans are left to fend for themselves and are marginalized, scapegoated by the media. The moment in US history is also considered the birth of a Korean American identity as we know it today. November 4th, 1992, Jae Kim is elected to the US House of Representatives and becomes the first Korean American to be elected to the United States Congress. And today we have 4 Korean Americans representing different districts in the United States Congress. September 14th, 1994, Korean American actor Margaret Cho's sitcom, All American Girls, premieres ABC and is the first network sitcom to feature predominantly Asian American cast. Korean American Day is declared by the US government in 2005. So we celebrate January 13 as Korean American Day every year. 2015, David Yu becomes the first Korean American elected to the Los Angeles City Council. During the 2018 Winter Olympic Games, Korean American Chloe Kim becomes the youngest woman to win Olympic gold medal in snowboarding at the Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea. During the February 2020 Oscar, Parasite wins award for the Best Picture, Directing, International Feature Film, and Writing, and making the first foreign language film and Korean film to win such an honor. And as you know, this year, the Minari won Best Picture award from Oscar as well. So not only a Korean picture, Parasite, but Minari is a Korean American film. Unfortunately, a Golden Globe categorized as a foreign language film, but it is a story of a Korean immigrant coming to America to realize their American dream. So I think you can also use Minari as a film, a document, the Korean American story that could fit in with the students. And for those of you who wants to learn more about Korean American history, community identity, I co-authored, I wrote a short history, a concise history of Korean American, edited by Mary Connor, teaching East Asia, Korea lessons, and resources for K-12 classrooms. Also, I have written several articles and book on ethnic peace in American City, mainly talking about LA civil unrest riots. And Korean Americans Concise History is you can purchase at Amazon.com. And there is a Clash of Colors. It's an hour-and-a-half documentary. You can watch it on YouTube on LA riots. And Eric Parker, LA Burning, the riots 25 years later. There are many documentaries on LA riots to commemorate in 25th anniversary. During the 25th anniversary, not only A&E, History Channel, and other many other outlets channel, they aired. I think there aired about 6 documentaries were aired to commemorate to 25th anniversary of LA riots in 2017. Korean Frontier in America, written by Wayne Patterson, would be a good resource book. And we already talked about these resources. Tom Jennings, The Lost Tapes, LA Riots, Smithsonian Channel. And this is the book that I recommend because it's a very thin book, less than 100 pages long, close to about 100 pages, provides very succinct Korean American History 101. So it could be a good resource book. So I just basically introduced a lesson plan I submitted and adopted by California Department of Education on LA riots, interethnic relations, and from mostly Korean American perspective. So this could be a good resource guide for teachers in your classroom to utilize as a resource to talk about not only Korean American history, identity, or interethnic relations, particularly with African American communities. And maybe also you can apply to Latinx communities, since many Korean immigrants also own and operate small businesses in predominantly Latino immigrant communities as well. So I think I spent about 40 minutes going over quickly the lesson plans. So if we can engage in Q&A, I think that could be more constructive as I can talk more about other issues as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. If you have any questions about Korean ethnic studies and Dr. Chang's presentation, please feel free to use chat box, or you can just ask questions in person.
So if you have a question, yes, chat box, or please click the raise hand button. Or maybe I can see your hand if you go like this. We'll maybe have like 10 minutes of questions, starting with Susan in the chat. One question, what do you think about today's discussion on critical race theory? Dr. Chang?
The whole purpose of ethnic studies model curriculum adopted by California State Legislature is to introduce the importance of sensuality of race in American society. Without talking about race, whether you are familiar with the critical race theory or not, the race has been central in American societies over the last more than 200 years. And yet we fail to provide very complex issue of race, sensuality of race to our students. Instead, majority of history or social sciences textbooks in K-12 were pretty much represent mainstream America without really talking about complexity of race. And whether it's African American history, or in this case, Asian American history, simply majority of students are growing up not knowing American history. It's very complex. So critical race theory try to bring different dimension, different perspective. You know, when we talk about history or society, I think it's important to bring different perspective and put students in different way. By bringing in different perspective that are different from mainstream perspective, I think it challenges dominant paradigm and how to incorporate experiences of marginalized groups, such as African American, Latinx, Asian Americans, Korean American perspective, Native American perspective. What does it really mean to be American from marginalized perspective? I think in that sense, it's important to talk about and discuss in classroom setting, so where our students broaden their perspective. And that's where critical race theory comes in.
Thank you for the answer and for the question. Another question, why is it considered a new concept if it has been taught for over 40 years? I took a class in 1979 from Elaine Kim at UC Berkeley. Weren't her classes focused on critical race theory?
Yeah, I mean, at college level, we've always have this theory and taught, but we are talking about K-12 education. K-12 education have not embraced. And that's one of the reasons why the California state of California decided to implement ethnic studies model curriculum. So now we are introducing this concept into K-12 education, whereas the UCs and CSUs, ethnic studies and other departments have taught students, college students, this concept.
Yes, and thank you for the replies. Feel free to continue to use the chat to also interact with each other. We have two more questions as of now. Jeff Kim asks, Dr. Chang, what do you recommend is the best approach of how to discuss Korean American history in context with Asian American history and the history of other ethnic groups?
Well, Korean American story is part of Asian American history, right? So if you look at the history of Asian American history in California in particular, it begins with Chinese immigration, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 pretty much sets the tone of how next group, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Asian Indians were treated as a alien, ineligible to become citizen, second-class citizens. So I think it is important to contextualize within larger Asian American history, but there are some issues that are very unique to Korean American experiences, such as Christianity, church is very unique to Korean American experience, whereas a majority of Chinese and Japanese and the Filipinos have different religions. Filipinos are mostly Catholic, whereas the Chinese and Japanese or tend to be more Buddhist or Shintoism. So in that sense, Korean American story is part of Asian American history and story, but what are some unique elements of Korean American story? I think that it needs to be checked out and brought out and discussed.
Next person asked, can you recommend any works of fiction about the Korean American experience? This is from Fred Daly. He is an English teacher, high school English teacher from New Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, I already introduced a memoir of a cashier is an excellent memoir in reference to LA riots of 1992 from second generation perspective. So I think that could be interesting resource material. And Korean Americans' concise history is widely available in any a bookstore. So it's very inexpensive and easily accessible to teachers and students. And also, I strongly recommend that. Highly recommend.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions as of now, so maybe we'll do like 3 or 4 minutes more for questions. We'll do a group photo with everyone and then take maybe like a 5-minute break and begin our next lecture. Larry from Georgia asks, in what ways were Korean Americans scapegoated in 1992?
Well, many of you may remember rooftop Koreans. During LA riots of 1992, basically LAPD abandoned Koreatown and city. All the police officers were recalled and they were protecting their own headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. And Koreatown was burning, and Koreatown stores were looted, and many Korean immigrants decided that we have to protect our own store. This is our livelihood. This is our American dreams. So many of them armed themselves and went on rooftop and try to protect. That's when mainstream media, the TV stations began focusing on these rooftop Koreans and blamed Korean immigrants for violence, basically. They were trying to protect their stores, and yet they were portrayed without contextualizing anything. They just showed those images in broad daylight, and Koreans were armed with rifles and the guns as if they were causing this major violence. So mainstream media played a major role, and ironically, NRA praised Korean immigrants for things. So, the Koreans were scapegoated both ways. By not contextualizing why and how Korean immigrants were arming themselves, simply to protect, LAPD abandoned Korean stores. So in that sense, many Korean immigrants were scapegoated and blamed for causing racial violence as well. LA riots was not caused by Korean immigrant store owners. It was neglect, racism, discrimination, police brutality, and poverty of inner city, abandoned by government. That was the root causes, and yet Korean immigrants were blamed as if they were the cause of this racial violence.
Thank you. Just a few more. Next question is, what is the target level of your students to teach the LA Riot 1992? Is it for major students or GE classes?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by GE classes or major, but I don't know. I'll leave it up to teachers yourself. I wrote this for 11th and the 12th grade level, but to what extent it's applicable, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with K-12 education.
Okay. Dr. Chang, how did the LA civil unrest resonate with Korean Americans outside of California?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It resonates very well with Californians. So we went through it, but even younger generation, they, LA's riots of 1992, today's college students, they only know through documentaries. They only heard about it. So unless you contextualize it and really provide why it's important to understand and learn about what happened to Korean Americans in 1992, it may not resonate. So I think it is important to place it and connect with current events, such as Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. What are some of the connections or similarities or even differences? Maybe students can resonate much better if you can connect it with the current events.
Dr. Chang, this one's a little. Oh,
I'm living in Chicago. So when during the LA riot, the Korean community leaders and with the help of other Asian community leaders, immediately start dialogue with the Black community leaders and try to diffuse the tension. There was a tension also in Chicago, but our community leaders were very effective in just breaking the tensions, and they established good rapport or good, better relations, and it has been going on since then. So there are some better communication and help. But recently, I don't know, recently, I have not really followed through.
Lucy, thanks for your comments. This next one, and I think it would be the last question for today. There's 3 questions in one chat. Dr. Chang, as a result of the 92 uprising, Koreans fell victim to racial fault lines, but birthed a new Korean American identity. How did that dynamic play out? Did younger generations push older generations to become more visible, etc.? Were there intergenerational pushback?
No, basically, although Korean immigrant stores were burned down, no one really cared. Mayor's office, city councilman's office, Sacramento, DC, politicians didn't care about Korean Americans at all. And we realized that that's because we are invisible politically. That's because we didn't get involved. And they gave them awareness that, it is critical for our survival, basically. And we have to get involved, and representation, a voice, and access. It became part of Korean American agenda because we were completely abandoned by the whole process system. So out of necessity, Korean immigrants became much more interested in getting involved politically because, to them it's a matter of survival, and not only survival, but also, realizing their American dreams. So I became political involvement, political empowerment became very, very important goal of the Korean American community.
All right. With that, I believe we will conclude Dr. Chang's segment. Maybe a round of applause for Dr. 장태환 박사님. 감사합니다.